Chapter 1040. Can you beat the ninth on the heaven leaderboard? Mississippi Lou actually asked him if he could beat the ninth on the heaven leaderboard. Other than grief and anger, Li was even more heartbroken. How could she not know what he was capable of? The top 10 of the Heaven Road list was a group of perverts that were weaker than her and Mingzhu. He did not lack experts, he did not lack great masters, he did not lack second great uncle who was even stronger than great masters. He even had a cheat that allowed him to level up in his sleep. But even so, he could not beat the ninth on the heaven leaderboard. As early as 2 years ago, the martial arts master ranking, especially the heaven leaderboard, had already turned into a sea of blood and corpses. With his current strength, if he was lucky, he could barely enter the top 20. Once the heaven leaderboard changed from 2 digits to 1 digit, the danger would increase exponentially. The ninth on the heaven leaderboard was an opponent that he could not fight head-on for now. When Li thought of this, the sadness in his heart could no longer be described with words. Not only did she brush him off, but she also changed the topic. The method she used to change the topic was so unskillful. She really did not love him anymore. Apart from the sadness, Li suddenly became vigilant. Murderous aura, there was murderous aura, strong murderous aura. He looked at the pretty boy beside him whose expression was even more sorrowful than his. He actually wanted to fight with him? Rui snatched his home and he actually wanted to fight with him? Rui looked at the pretty boy, then pointed at Li and said, "This is the Royal Highness Jianghu of Silla that you always mention." The pretty boy's chest heaved a few times. His face was flushed and he calmed down a little. He gritted his teeth and said, "Nice to meet you, Royal Highness Jianghu of Silla." Li glanced at him and asked, "What do you mean nice to meet you?" The pretty boy was startled and his chest began to heave again. "His name is Baisu." Mississippi Lou pointed at the pretty boy, looked at Li and said calmly, "Baisu ha Baisu. Why not call him Baisha? A gigolo is a gigolo. He looks like a girl, his voice is girly, even his name is so girly." So, Li was startled. He suddenly recalled something. Mississippi Lou seemed to have a subordinate named Baisu. She was the one in charge of the army of women. Before her, this position was held by Yang Liuqing. This showed how much Mississippi Lou trusted her. Li looked at the pretty boy who was glaring at him. She had no beard, no Adam's apple, pierced ears, a feminine voice and a feminine face, because she was a woman. He then looked at her chest. Although it couldn't be called a chest when she stood next to Rui, it did seem to protrude a little more than his. Li felt that he was really blind. Ninth on the heavenly roll. Indeed, one could not judge a book by its cover. Strength and breasts were not necessarily proportional. An extremely awkward expression surfaced on his face. "Hey young Miss Bai, how are you?" Baisu snorted coldly. "What's good about it?" Everything was good except for her chest. Li didn't know that a woman's chest could be so flat. Otherwise he wouldn't have recognized it wrongly. It seemed that it was not entirely impossible that Hua Mulan had been in the army for so many years without being discovered. Li glanced at her and realized that she was still looking at him with her teeth clenched. This young Miss Bai was pretty, but her temper wasn't very good. Why did she bear grudges so easily? Mississippi Lou explained, "Baisu used to admire you. So, I brought her back today to let her meet the legendary Royal Highness Jianghu of Silla." There were many women who admired him in the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. Everyone knew that Royal Highness Jianghu of Silla was handsome and well-versed in both literature and martial arts. Unfortunately, there would be one less today. After Baisu glared at him fiercely for a few times, he went to find Rui to ask questions about martial arts while Rui stayed behind. Mississippi Lou looked at him and said, "Let me see what's wrong with your hand." No. Li rejected her decisively. She said she wanted to see it, he would see it. If she said she had someone she liked, he would have it. If she said she didn't have it, he would lose face. If he agreed to these small things easily, he couldn't guarantee that she wouldn't ask for more in the future. Should he agree or pretend to resist before agreeing? "Will you give it to me?" "No." "Forget it then." Second Miss Lou shrugged her shoulders, then looked at him and said, "I lied to you this morning. How could I have a sweetheart?" "Swear." "Okay, I swear." Second young Mistress Lou raised her hand and said, "If I have a sweetheart, I will make him choke when eating, choke when drinking water, choke when eating fish, and choke when eating raccoons without seasoning packets." Mississippi Lou was very sincere in making such a vicious oath. However, she felt cold all over. Maybe she caught a cold because she didn't sleep well last night. She actually joked with him about such an important thing. Was this something she could joke about? In the past, Rui was as cold as ice and would draw her sword at the slightest provocation. But now she had learned from some bastard to be so naughty, making jokes that shouldn't be made. His poor hand had been injured twice in one day. Li Yi walked towards the kitchen. He waved his hand casually and said, "It's okay. I just accidentally cut myself." Bang! His hand accidentally hit the door frame, and the gauze that was no longer bleeding was immediately stained red. Li Yi felt that he should look at the almanac or find a monk or a Taoist priest to calculate whether he had been in trouble recently. He actually experienced 3 bloody disasters in one day, Mississippi. Lu walked over quickly and grabbed his hand. She looked back at Fong and said, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and get the gauze and medicinal wine." Fong immediately reacted. This was the 3rd time he had taken these 2 things today. Watching Mississippi Lu take off the gauze and open the medicinal wine, Li Yi hurriedly said, "I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself." Mississippi Lu crossed her arms in front of her chest and said, "Do it yourself. I'll see how you do it yourself." Li Yi didn't have a 3rd hand, so he couldn't do it himself. He looked at Fong and said, "What are you waiting for? Come and help." Fong looked at Second Miss and then looked at his son-in-law. He leaned against the door frame and shook his head. "Sorry, I don't know how to do it." Li Yi looked at him and said in surprise, "You didn't return it in the morning and afternoon?" "Sorry, I forgot." Fong continued to shake his head. Rebellion, rebellion. Fong actually embarrassed him in front of Rui. He didn't let him go to the Wu Kingdom to inquire about the news. "Don't be so wishy-washy. Let me do it." Mississippi Lu glared at him, grabbed his hand and carefully washed it with the medicinal wine. Then she opened the gauze, cut a section and carefully wrapped it. It had to be said that Rui's wound looked much better than Fong's. After wrapping it up, she put the gauze and medicinal wine aside. As if remembering something, she looked at Li Yi and asked, "Do you think a woman can really like another woman? Lesbians are infinitely good but they can't give birth." "What?" Li Yi looked at the butterfly knot on his hand and felt awkward no matter how he looked at it. He said casually, "There's no law that says a woman can't like another woman. Like a man or a woman or even like a person or not, it's the freedom of others." As he spoke, a shocked expression appeared on his face. He looked at Mississippi Lu and said with difficulty, You can't be saying." Mississippi Lu looked at him and nodded solemnly, "You guessed right." Li Yi stood rooted to the ground in a daze. He was able to guard against Ming Zhu, he was able to guard against the gigolo, but he was unable to guard against another woman. No. He looked angry. He grabbed Mississippi Lu's wrist and slapped her but twice. He said, "No, I don't agree. Your sister won't agree either. Just give up. You've grown up, haven't you? What do you mean you don't like women? Don't you like women too?" Fong stood at the door and looked at the scene in the kitchen. The green bristle grass in his mouth had already fallen to the ground. The sun was not scorching today but he felt like he was blind. The son-in-law actually dared to do that to the second miss. He looked at the knife in the kitchen and was ready to grab it at any time. He was worried that the second miss would chop off the son-in-law's hand. "I'm just kidding. Don't be so serious, Mississippi." Lu shook off his hand and looked at the vegetables that had not been cut yet. She said, "Your hand is injured. Leave it to me. You go outside and wait." "Damn it. What the hell?" Fong couldn't help but curse in a low voice when he saw the son-in-law walk out of the kitchen unscathed. He picked up the green bristle grass on the ground and put it next to Li Yi's mouth. He asked, "Son-in-law, tell me how you feel." "No, I don't feel anything." Li Yi's voice was a little shaky. Old Fong looked at his hands. Li Yi raised one of his palms, which were also trembling non-stop. He looked back at Mississippi Lu, who was wearing an apron and busy in the kitchen. He murmured, "What the hell?" Chapter 1041. Li Yi thought that the day of his wedding would be the pinnacle of his life. That day he spanked Mississippi Lu's but to avenge his years of humiliation. Of course, the consequences of reaching the pinnacle were painful. His stomach hurt for several days, but after the pa sound, the carefree feeling that came from the depths of his soul was something that he would never forget for the rest of his life. This was something that no matter how much money he earned or how high his title was, it could not compare to. He thought that after that day, there would no longer be a pinnacle in his life. Who would have thought that after 2 months he could easily reach the pinnacle of his life? Mississippi Lu did not beat him, nor did she scold him. She even helped him cut the vegetables and cook the rice. This was not Rui, this was Rui. After dinner he sat in the yard thinking about this problem. Mississippi Lu sat opposite him. Li could not help but shiver. He was ready to run away when she came to settle the score. Mississippi Lu looked at his fingers and asked, "What happened to you today?" Li Yi's 2 fingers were wrapped in gauze. He looked down, shook his head and said, I was accidentally distracted at that time. What were you thinking about? You were distracted when you were cutting vegetables? Mississippi Lu looked at him. Li always felt that her eyes were very aggressive, as if she could see through his mind. Oh, well, I was thinking again. In the future when I make porridge I should put less sugar. Li nodded and said so. Why less? Didn't you say that you don't like sweets? Who said that I don't like sweets? Mississippi Lu looked at him and said, I have always liked it. Li was a little happy. He knew it. He knew that Mississippi Lu still liked him and liked the sugar porridge he made. Well, there is one more thing. Li thought for a moment, then looked at her and said, It's too hot these days. We're going to move to the mountains for a while. Do you want to come? It was already July. From a few days ago, the weather began to be unbearably hot. Of course, with the ice house and the ice mirror, it didn't matter whether the weather was hot or not. However, Li Yi and Rui were worried that the coolness created by the ice would affect Zue Mo's body. It just so happened that Wang Wei wrote a letter saying that it was very cool in the mountains these days. Li Yi and Rui discussed it and planned to go there to avoid the heat and come out when the weather was cooler. Go, why not? There are still some disobedient people there. It's time to subdue them. He and Zue Mo would go there, and naturally Ruoqing would not be missing. Xuanhuan, Xiao Chui and Xiao Zhu would definitely follow, and Li Duan, Yongning and Mississippi Lu would not be left behind. So this time they should be going into the mountains to be bandits. Because Zue Mo was pregnant, he was busy all day and had no time to arrange things there. This time he could go there and deal with the rest. Looking at the back of Mississippi Lu walking back to her room, Li Yi was deep in thought. Rui changed all of a sudden. She really became gentle like never before. At this moment he actually found it a little difficult to adapt. Inexplicably he would feel an itch on his butt. Sure enough, he was infected by Fang. Inside the room, Mississippi Lu closed the door, walked to the bed and took out the book under her pillow. Looking at the book in her hand, a rare look of respect and admiration appeared on her face. This trace of respect and admiration was naturally for the owner of this book. The fringe. It was more appropriate to call the fringe a new world. The new world was naturally relative to the three kingdoms of Qi, Jing and Wu. A new trade route had been opened up here. Not only was it easy to travel, it was more importantly safe. In the past, the fringe had many forces and bandits. Although there were still many bandits now, they were unified by a powerful force. At least on this trade route it was absolutely safe. Commander Wang Wei, who had already fulfilled his childhood dream and had even surpassed his initial thought of making a name for himself and showing that tigress, stood on the top of the mountain. The mountain wind made his clothes flutter in the wind. He rubbed his bald head out of habit and couldn't help but feel a sense of lofty sentiments. A figure came along the mountain path and said in a low voice, Commander, His Highness is here. Where are we now? We've reached the stockade. Bastard, why didn't you say so earlier? The commander's temperament that Wang Wei had painstakingly put on disappeared in an instant. He ran down the mountain. The reason why Li Yi chose to stay here for the summer was that after several years of construction, apart from the inconvenient transportation, this place was even more prosperous than Yong County town. Of course, for strategic reasons, to avoid the possibility of being surrounded by the army in the future, the road up the mountain could not be very convenient. Almost every mountain was easy to defend and difficult to attack, and there were also sufficient retreat routes. In terms of these, no one knew better than these bandits. The mountain was indeed much cooler than the prefecture city. The air was fresh and the scenery was beautiful. Rui and Rui had grown up in the mountains, but it was the first time that Ruoqing and Drunken Mo had seen such a city in the mountains. Li Duan and Yongning were also full of novelty. They were full of energy and did not look tired at all. Although Wang Wei looked a little fierce, his mind was rare, and he knew how to persist in doing things. He had a kind of energy that would not turn back until he hit the wall, and if he hit the wall he would continue to stride forward. Most importantly, in terms of being a bandit, he was very talented. It was said that his ancestors had bandit genes, so he managed this place in an orderly manner. He also built a prince's residence here. Although it was not as big as the Jianghu of Silla's residence in Yong County, it was still the most magnificent building here. Could be said that he was very thoughtful. When they walked on the Bluestone Street, two people came from a distance with a man in custody. Li looked at the three people passing by and asked, "This is?" After Wang Wei went forward and asked, he came back and said, "These guys, they don't use the latrine. They always like to relieve themselves at the street corner. They don't change their ways, so I have to lock them up for 3 days before letting them out." Wang Wei actually liked to relieve himself anywhere in the past. Everyone was not particular and there could be latrines everywhere in the mountains. But now that the prince was here, if these people made this place stinky, how could he, Commander Wang, put his face? Therefore a few days ago he issued a death order. In the future, everyone's 3 urgent needs must be solved in the latrine. Those who disobeyed the order would be locked up and served. Li could understand his approach. Most of the people here were bandits and they were used to being careless. When they were in the mountains, they were used to relieving their physiological needs anywhere. But it was really not possible here. On such a hot day, if everyone peed outside, the smell could be imagined. But thinking about it carefully, there was still a big loophole in this solution. Li thought about it and asked, "Is it useful to lock them up?" "It's useless." Wang Wei shook his head with a bitter smile and said, "These guys are used to being casual. They have always been like this. They would rather solve it outside the latrine than go in." Li waved his hand and said, "Since it's useless, there's no need to lock them up. If the punishment for urinating and defecating anywhere was not to work and still have food and drink, then this punishment was no different from a reward." Wang Wei was still too straightforward. If it was Fang who was the traitor, then the problem of urinating and defecating anywhere in the stronghold would have been solved long ago. Wang Wei was startled and looked troubled. "But Your Highness, we can't just ignore it." Li shook his head. "Ignore it? Who said I don't want to?" Wang Wei turned his head and looked at the indifferent expression of His Highness. Suddenly he felt a chill in his heart. In the confinement room, a man was brought in. He turned his head and said with a smile, "Old Wang, remember to bring me some beef noodles from Lu Ji's for dinner. Add more beef and more noodles. Add more chopped green onions and coriander." After saying that, he lay down on a bed in the corner and stretched comfortably. He put his hands behind his head. Boss Wang was really something. He just couldn't hold it in and had to be locked up for 3 days. However, 3 days was fine. 3 days was pretty good. He didn't have to work for 3 days and he wouldn't starve. Never in his dreams would he have thought that there was such a good thing in this world. When he was released 3 days later, he would come back. As he was thinking about this, the door of the confinement room opened from the outside. A bald man stood outside and looked at him. He said, "Come out." "So soon?" He sat up from the bed with a hint of regret on his face. Could it be that Boss Wang had gone back on his word? However, the bald man didn't let him leave. Instead, he brought him to another place. Through the window, he could see more than 10 children sitting in seats with their hands behind their backs. They were swaying their heads along with an old man in front of them. He was a little confused. This was a school. He always felt that building a school in the stronghold was unnecessary. Only those with families would send their children here. Anyway, they didn't need to pay, so he just treated it as looking after the children. Why did this little bald man bring him here? To see which brat didn't study hard and beat him up. Chapter 1042. At the entrance of the academy, the young baldy looked at the man and said indifferently, "You will attend this class with them. If you can pass the exam for this class, then you can leave. If you can't pass, then you can only eat steamed buns and drink water today. If you can't pass today, then in the next 2 days, you will have to pass 2 more exams." The man was stunned. Like most of the people here, he had never been to school and didn't know a word. When he heard the old man shaking his head and talking, he dozed off. He didn't even know how to hold a brush. What kind of exam was this? He just peed. Was there a need to be like this? He pursed his lips, looked at the bald man and asked, "What if I still can't pass tomorrow?" "If you still can't pass." The bald man patted him on the shoulder and comforted him. In fact, steamed buns and plain water are the most nourishing. Although Commander Wang usually treated people kindly, many people were still afraid of him when he was serious. Not long after, the man walked into the school dejectedly and sat in the last row. The young bald man went forward and said a few words to the old teacher. The old man nodded and glanced at the back row. He didn't care about the man anymore. The man sat in the back row. When he saw the eyes of the children around him, his face was a little red. He simply lay on the table and slept. He really didn't believe that Boss Wang was crazy to let him sit in the school with these little children to study. Did he want him to be the top scorer? He, Wang Dezhuang, was not meant to be a scholar in his life. Listening to the old man's voice, he felt sleepy. After an unknown amount of time, he was pushed awake by a little fat man sitting next to him. The little fat man handed him a piece of paper and a pen and said, "The teacher said to write down the 5 words he just taught." The man looked at him with a dull face. Before writing it down, he needed to know what words the old man had taught him, how to write those words and how to hold the pen. He looked at the little fat man, smiled and said, "How about you write one for me? I'll go out and buy you candied hawthorn." "My family sells candied hawthorn." The little fatty looked at him and shook his head. Also, teacher said that I can't write for him or I'll be punished too. The man looked at him helplessly. Then can you at least copy it for me? Not giving. The little fatty replied bluntly. He turned his back to her and began to write on his own. The man grabbed the brush and looked at the white paper on the table. His face was lifeless and he didn't know what to write. After a while, the pen in front of him disappeared and so did the paper. In its place was a cup of water, a steamed bun and a bald head. The baldy looked at him and said, "Tomorrow is a poetry recitation test. The day after tomorrow is poetry recitation. The day after that you might have to learn arithmetic. The commander said that the 5 words that you didn't write today have to be filled in. Take care." With that he turned around and left. The man sat in his original position in a daze, reciting poems, writing from memory, calculating. They wanted him dead. The man shuddered and hurriedly ran out. He didn't see the baldy, but he saw the little fatty who stopped him from copying. The little fatty was licking a stick of candied hawthorn. The man snatched it from his hand and took a bite. He threatened, "Kid, write one for me tomorrow or I'll beat you up." The little fatty didn't cry or make a fuss when his candied hawthorn was snatched away. He just turned around and looked at an 8 feet tall muscular man behind him. He said, "Dad, he snatched my candied hawthorn and wanted to beat me up." A shadow suddenly appeared in front of the man. He raised his head and looked at the man who was much more muscular than him. He trembled and said, "Big brother, it's a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding my ass." It was much cooler in the mountains than outside, but there were more mosquitoes. Li Yi and Drunken Mo couldn't compare to Rui and Rui. The mosquitoes would avoid them, so he could only make a few mosquito traps. Fortunately, they were very effective. Mississippi Lu stayed in the mountains for a few days before she went out with the Lu Meng's men. It seemed that she was going to sweep through the entire fringe. The fringe was actually very vast. They had only opened a trade route from the Qi Kingdom to the Jing Kingdom, cleared all the hidden dangers around the trade route, and had just started to advance to the periphery. Mississippi Lu set her sights on the entire fringe. Not only did she want to be the ruler of the New World, she also wanted to be the ruler of all the mountains in the fringe. What Li Yi needed to do was to stabilize the rear, provide her with strategic support, resources, and be the man behind the scenes. On a hidden mountain, Li Yi looked at the rows of towering buildings in front of him. Once again he felt that Wang Wei was quite reliable. He had an entire library in his mind. He could do so many things with it. He could create many things that were considered black technology in this world, but he was only one person and he was lazy. If he really wanted to accomplish these things, he would need to live for 500 years and then borrow another 500 years from God. Perhaps a few hundred years would not be enough. Even if he had a lifetime of hundreds or thousands of years, it would still be impossible to bring out all the knowledge in his mind. Things like the technology tree should be left to Li Xian. He couldn't even handle Rui, so he had no interest in these things, but he didn't really want to waste his hard-earned cheat. After all, other than copying books, poems, and peeking at other people's diaries, this thing still had other uses. Li Yi asked Wang Wei to open up an industrial area far away from the village. They would conduct research on things like iron smelting, coke making, and forging. Although it was called research, it was actually just him telling them to do it. These would be very useful in the future. Although they couldn't use it for now, it was better to be prepared. For the time being, this would be the breakthrough point. The rest would be developed slowly in the future. At the back of the classroom. In the corner of the back row, a man looked at the little fatty beside him and swallowed his saliva. He watched as the little fatty chewed on the chicken drumstick in his hand and said, "Little brother, when you come tomorrow, can you secretly bring me some salted vegetables?" He had been eating steamed buns and drinking plain water for 7 days. He had lost a lot of weight, and the reason for all this was because he had peed outside the toilet. He couldn't understand it now. The toilet was clean and tidy, and there was no smell after he flushed it. Why did he have to pee outside? This was despicable. The little fatty nodded with great difficulty. He immediately picked up a pen and pointed at a word on the paper with the tip of the pen. He asked, "Little brother, how do I pronounce this word? I've forgotten. Can you teach me again?" He felt extremely miserable. The school was really too scary. Even if he were to move stones outside, it would be better than sitting here and reading. The detention room not far from the school had also been transformed into a new school. In the past month, people who urinated, spat, and did not pay attention to hygiene were all caught and brought here. Here they didn't have to move stones, pave bridges, or repair roads. They didn't have to do anything. They could spend their days swimming in the sea of knowledge, experiencing the joy of reading. Haha, I passed. I can go out now. Suddenly, a person rushed out from inside and stood on the street looking like a madman. After laughing, he looked down at his hands with a pained expression. These were a pair of hands used to chop people, but they had been used to write for the past few days. He wrote non-stop all night, and if he couldn't finish he could only eat steamed buns and drink plain water. He wasn't even given a salted vegetable. Suddenly a few hands reached out from the window. Someone exhorted loudly, "Brother, brother, come back. Stay for another 2 days and teach us too." That person stood on the street and laughed maniacally. "Even if I die outside, starve to death, suffocate to death, or jump off the mountain to my death, I won't go back." In a room somewhere in the stronghold, Commander Wang touched his bald head. He was surprised to find that in the entire stronghold, there hadn't been a case of people urinating, spitting, and littering everywhere for a long time. In the short span of half a month, this problem that had been troubling him for years had actually been cured. Chapter 1043. The group of people who were used to using the sky as their blanket and the earth as their bed, and eating, drinking and defecating on the bed suddenly became particular. No one peed or spat on the ground anymore. The village looked brand new. Wang Wei was once again impressed by His Royal Highness Jianghu of Silla's wisdom. Setting up a school in the stockade was indeed useful. In the past he had thought that it was superfluous. Now it seemed that people who had been educated were indeed different. Those guys had only been in the school for a short period of time, but they had already become civilized and polite. When his child was born and grew up, he would also send him to the school and let the teacher teach him well. Li also heard about this from Wang Wei. He felt a little regretful. His subordinates were a group of boorish men. They would pick up a knife and cut people without hesitation, but when he asked them to pick up a pen and write, it was like asking for their lives. He gave them a free chance to improve themselves and surpass themselves, but none of them cherished it. Ning Yuan was unwilling to go back to the school even if he moved stones to build bridges and roads. This made it impossible to implement the other ideas that Fang gave him. For example, they could be confined for half a month and sent food and water every day, but there was no toilet in the confinement room. Anyway, they were used to doing it on the spot. Another idea was to erect a monument in front of the village and engrave their names and heroic deeds on it for future generations to admire. Or, forget it, it was too disgusting, no more examples. No one was willing to study. Even if they had to hold their urine to death outside, they were unwilling to go back to the school. Perhaps they had already realized that there was no end to learning and that it was still possible to repent. But this also exposed a major problem. He was very short of high-end talents under his command. Just look at Second Miss Lu in the past and you can see how much martial artists despised reading, not to mention those bandits. To put it bluntly, they were just a bunch of unruly people. They could swarm up and shout to kill, and they had some strength in repairing bridges and roads. However, when it came to management or charging and breaking through enemy lines according to rules, they were far from being good at it. This was not what Li Yi wanted to see, nor was it what Mississippi Lu wanted to see. Mississippi Lu had left half a month ago to occupy more mountains. Before she left some of Lu Meng's people here to train Wang Wei's men. If it wasn't for the fact that life was really tough, no one would be willing to become a bandit. Many people were ordinary people before they became bandits, and they also had families to support them. After being subdued, some of them relied on their own efforts to earn a family business and brought their families here. Now this place was no different from an ordinary town. Li Yi selected a group of people who were educated and tried to cultivate some talents in other fields. Currently he focused on industrial fields such as machinery and materials. Of course he didn't need them to come into contact with advanced things. As long as he explained some simple theories, they would be able to understand and put them into practice. At this time he started to miss Li Xian. The real talents that he needed were almost all in the Academy of Sciences. He still had to poach some people from his side. "Your Highness, it's done." Wang Wei strode in from outside with a pile of swords and knives in his hands. He threw them on the ground with a clatter. Li Yi stood up and walked to the front. Wang Wei picked up 2 knives from the ground and held them in his hands. He said, "Your Highness, look. This is an ordinary knife and this one was just made by them." He waved both his hands at the same time. With a clang, sparks flew everywhere. The knife in his right hand was undamaged, but the one in his left hand had an obvious chip. Clang. He slashed twice again. The knife in his left hand broke into 2 pieces, but the one in his right hand was still intact. Fang, who had just walked in from outside, stared at the knife in Wang Wei's hand. His eyes lit up and he muttered, "Treasure, treasure." Wang Wei looked at him and said generously, "You like it? If you like it, I'll give it to you." He handed the knife to Fang, but Fang did not take it. A hint of vigilance appeared on his face and he said, "What do you want? I can't afford to offend that tigress of yours. You didn't play cards with me yesterday. You'd better find another reason to fool her." "Oh, I didn't go back. What reason do I need? I'm not you even afraid of your wife. If you have the guts, say this again in front of her later. Why should I listen to you?" Li ignored these two guys who were unwilling to admit the truth. He picked up the two swords from the ground and carefully examined them. After the improvement of the smelting and forging methods, the quality of the steel had indeed improved a lot. Although it was still far from the level of cutting through iron like mud, compared to ordinary weapons, it could already be called a treasure. Since it was a treasure, it could be sold for money, a lot of money. He was already very rich, but he had so many subordinates who needed to eat, invest in construction, and support his squandering sister-in-law Rui. When it came to things like money, the more the better. Rui's autumn water was a good sword. In terms of sharpness and toughness, it was not comparable to the one in his hand. However, that sword must have been forged by a skilled master craftsman after thousands of tempering. Although it could be sold for a very good price, the cost was not low. Mass production was different. The technological reform and cost reduction allowed them to easily create divine weapons in the eyes of ordinary people. This was not a divine weapon, it was all money. In the Jing kingdom, the richest people were in the capital. In the Qi kingdom, the richest people were in the capital. After pondering for a moment, Li Yi felt that it was time to let those foreign merchants from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland out. No, I almost forgot. After the incident with Lioli, whether in the Qi kingdom or the Jing kingdom, if those foreign merchants dared to show up, they would be caught and dismembered immediately. This time he changed the method. He sat down at the table again and began to write to Li Xian. Hibiscus Garden, the capital. Li Xian held a dagger in his hand. He easily cut a few holes in the long saber of the opposite guard. He nodded with a satisfied look on his face. After sending so many gifts, that stingy guy finally knew to return the favor. This dagger was not bad. It was extremely sharp and exceptionally tough. Even the treasures in the palace could not compare to it. Could be called a divine weapon. It could be said that he was considerate. However, he soon realized a problem. This dagger was forged by him. In other words, he had mastered a new forging method. He did not tell me, I have done everything for him, but he kept it from me. There was a look of indignation on his face. If it were not for the heavenly weapon, he would not have ordered for him to find the best blacksmith in the Jing kingdom. At some point, the guard behind him bowed slightly. "Greetings, Your Highness." Two women walked side by side from afar. The younger one on the left looked at him and asked, "Brother, did Sir send another letter?" Li Xian looked at Xianxia, who had completely lost her innocence and naivety. He smiled and said, "Not only did he send a letter, come and take a look at this." He showed off the sharpness of the dagger in front of Mingzu and Xianxia. He said in a boastful tone, "Although this dagger is a little short in terms of sharpness, even the treasures in the palace could not compare to it. It can be called a priceless divine weapon." After saying that, he seemed to have thought of something. He pointed behind him and said, "He brought you a gift too. Go open it." The two women walked over slowly and opened the two long brocade boxes on the table behind him. After being stunned for a while, they turned their heads at the same time and looked at the dagger in Li Xian's hand. Li Xian was stunned. He then smiled and said, "If you like this divine weapon, I can lend it to you for a few days. But remember to return it to me. I still need to use it for research." Xianxia closed the brocade box discreetly. She shook her head and said, "It's fine, you're welcome. I will ask him to give you two next time." Li Xian walked over and asked in confusion, "What did he give you?" "It's nothing." Xianxia shook her head and picked up the brocade box. She said, "Brother, I still have something to do in the academy. I will leave first." The brocade box was too long. It was at least 4 feet long. When she turned around, she accidentally knocked over the other one. The box landed on the ground. When the lid was opened, the thing inside the box was revealed. It was a long sword. The sword was more than 3 feet long. The hilt of the sword was carved into a lifelike phoenix. The scabbard was carved with complicated patterns. It was unusually exquisite. There was also a row of more than 10 jewels inlaid on it. Under the illumination of the sun, it shone brightly. Li Xian was stunned. He lowered his head and picked up the sword. He seemed to have thought of something. He unsheathed the sword and waved it at the wooden table beside him. Crack! A white light flashed. The wooden table was split into two and fell to the side. He looked at the long sword in his hand and the short dagger in his other hand. One was more than 3 feet long and the other was less than 1 foot long. One of the scabbard was exquisite and inlaid with jewels. It was priceless. The other one did not have a scabbard. It was sent in a wooden box. He suddenly felt a little sad. Chapter 1044. In Jingdo, when the imperial guards of the palace pasted the imperial notices on the city gates and various streets and alleys in conspicuous places, commoners quickly surrounded them. In the early years, it was rare to see imperial notices posted. When the former emperor was on the throne, he only pasted one when he searched for famous doctors to treat a certain princess in the palace. Later, when the current emperor opened a mathematics school, he often posted notices like this to search for craftsmen among the commoners. By now, the commoners were no longer surprised by this. A scholar who passed by had already deciphered the contents of the imperial notice, causing a lot of discussion among the people. This time, the emperor wanted to recruit skilled blacksmiths from all over the Jing kingdom. It was said that food, accommodation, and women would be provided. Those with families would also be given a courtyard in the capital. Apart from that, they would also receive a monthly subsidy from the country. If they were a famous master blacksmith, they might even be able to get a position in the Academy of Sciences. From then on, they would be able to bring glory to their family, reach the sky in a single step, and make their ancestors proud. In short, as long as one had a skill, one would be able to live a good life in the capital city in the Jing kingdom. Even if one was an old farmer, as long as his land was better than others and his harvest was greater than others, there would still be some officials from the Academy of Sciences who would be willing to call him teacher and humbly ask him questions. A scholar in a green robe looked at the imperial notice posted on the city wall, then looked at the book he had just bought and sighed. The book in his hand was this year's imperial examination secret scroll, which he had spent a lot of money and pulled a lot of strings to buy. A blacksmith could get food, accommodation, and marriage services. It was a pity that he had not passed the imperial examination. At the age of coronation, he had not married and had not even touched a woman's hand. It was not that he had not touched a woman's hand. Yesterday when he was buying vegetables, the auntie who sold vegetables had touched him. Thinking of this, he could not help but feel sad. He threw the book in his hand to the ground and strode away. 10 years of studying hard could not compare to 10 years of forging iron. What was the use of reading such a useless book? After a few steps he turned around and walked back. He picked up the book on the ground, patted the dust off it, and carefully put it in his pocket. He still had to study. Even if he didn't pass the exam, he would become a blacksmith in the future. Between a blacksmith who had studied and a blacksmith who only knew how to forge iron, there was no need to even think about whose future was brighter. What's more, this thing cost a lot of money. Blacksmith Su was an ordinary blacksmith in the capital. He originally had a name, but his neighbors had been calling him Blacksmith Su, or Blacksmith Su for decades. He couldn't remember how long it had been since someone last mentioned his real name. He had just come back from the city wall, so naturally he had heard the latest news. The spring of blacksmiths that he had been looking forward to was finally here. Carpenter Wang, who lived next door, had entered the Academy of Sciences 2 years ago. Although he was only doing odd jobs for the great craftsman of the Ministry of Works, he had built a 2-story courtyard this year and arranged a marriage for his silly son. The bride was going to be married this year, and his life was enviable. The old gangster who sold pornography diagonally across the street was also living a comfortable life because he could tell what people were saying just by looking at their lips. It was said that he was a teacher at the Academy of Sciences and had a group of disciples. He even boasted that he had taught the current emperor. Blacksmith Su's son was still young, so he wasn't in a hurry to arrange a marriage for him. As a blacksmith, he didn't have the extravagant hope of becoming a teacher for the emperor. All he wanted was to earn more money and let his family of 3 live a more comfortable life. He glanced at his son who was playing outside the door. He didn't forge iron, but leaned comfortably on the chair and took a sip of the good wine that he had just bought from the tavern. He had already signed up for the recruitment on the imperial notice board, and now he just had to wait for the notification. Outside the door, a few young children were running happily in the streets. Eat my wind god's kick. I know the cloud-splitting palm. I have the snow-guzzling saber. I have the peerless sword. The world of children was always carefree. They weren't old enough to study, so they only thought about eating and playing every day. Sometimes they would sneak into the brothel to listen to stories. The brothel was the most magical place in their hearts. There were monkeys waving sticks and fighting their way up to the 33 levels of heaven. There were various immortals and gods that they had never heard of. There were also many martial arts masters and heroic deeds of chivalrous heroes. After listening to stories in the brothel, they would play the roles they liked and reenact the stories they had heard. It was a game that they never got tired of. They were acting out a new story in the brothel, which was the plot of Wind and Cloud. Wind God's kick, cloud-splitting palm, snow-guzzling saber, and the peerless sword, each of them had a dream of being a hero. They wanted to learn the peerless martial arts and help the weak, punish the weak, and fight the evil in the martial world. That was what the story said. Of course, since he was a chivalrous hero, he needed a suitable weapon, a martial art move that sounded powerful, and a fine horse. The horse had to be beautiful, and it would be best if it was tall and big. Only then would Squire Zhang's son xuanhuan ride the same horse as him. Xuanhuan lived in xuanhuan's house. He didn't have a horse or a weapon. He didn't know where the sword-worshipping villa that the old grandpa mentioned was. It was said that there were many peerless godly weapons there. If he could get one, brother, don't be angry. Playing with the dagger in her hand, Xianxia looked at Li Xian and said, Master once said that simplicity is beauty. Look at this dagger. It's simple and clean. The scabbard is simple and the curve of the blade is smooth. Simplicity was beauty. Li Xian naturally understood this principle. However, when Xianxia comforted him, she couldn't walk back and forth. She was holding the long sword in her other hand, and the gem on the scabbard was shining so brightly that he couldn't open his eyes. Looking at her serious expression, Li Xian asked, How about we exchange? Xianxia was dazed and said in surprise, But brother, this sword is for women. I don't mind. Li Xian looked at her and said, You can have the simple and beautiful dagger. Brother, are you serious? Yes. I won't exchange. After saying that, the pretty woman turned around and left. She walked out of the hall and did not look back even once. Li Xian sat back down and looked at the dagger on the table angrily. He had thought that it was a unique godly weapon. It was indeed unique. Among the 3 gifts he gave, this was the most special, simple and shabby one, the shortest. He knew that he wouldn't compete with Mingzu to avoid humiliating himself. But Xianxia. Thinking of the girl just now, forget it, Xianxia wouldn't compete with him. He would still be humiliating himself. Thinking of this, he actually felt a little better. Then he opened another letter. Sword Greeting Villa, a batch of peerless godly weapons. After reading the letter, he had a rough idea of what Li Yi wanted to do. If he was a shepherd, then the officials and nobles in the capital were the fat sheep raised by his family. A few years ago he used the colored glass to make these fat sheep shed a layer of wool. Now that new wool had grown, he was here again. He was the emperor and those people were his subjects. Although it was easy for them to make money, he couldn't let him fool them again and again. If it weren't for the fact that the Academy of Sciences had several big projects that needed funding, if it weren't for the fact that his second child was about to be born, if it weren't for the fact that Mingzi didn't allow him to squander the money in the national treasury, he would never agree to Li Yi doing this. He walked out of the door and said to a guard, Tell them that 280 is not enough, at least 370. At the gate of the capital, several carriages came from afar. Before they entered the city, they were stopped by the guards at the gate. One of the generals came forward and asked, What's in the carriages? A man smiled and said, Some goods. What goods? The general lifted the black cloth covering the carriages and opened a box. After taking a look, his expression changed. He opened a few more boxes and his expression darkened. He took a few steps back and waved his hand. Seeing this, the guards behind him immediately surrounded the carriages. Only then did the general come forward and ask, Do you have the seal of the imperial court? Smuggling weapons was a serious crime, not to mention that there were so many of them. If they didn't have the seal of the imperial court, these people had to be arrested and interrogated immediately. Of course we do. The leader nodded and took out something that looked like a piece of silk from his sleeve and handed it over. After carefully examining it, the general waved his hand and the guards behind him left. The carriages drove through the gate. The general was still a little worried and went forward to ask, Where did these things come from? In front of the carriages, the man turned around and said with a smile, Sword Greeting Villa. Chapter 1045. There were 2 markets in the capital, the east and the west, selling a wide variety of goods. It was the largest market in the vicinity of the Jing kingdom. Of course, apart from the row upon row of shops and the endless stalls on the streets, there were also all kinds of strange things. For example, a chicken with 3 legs, a bird without legs, a stone man with words on its body, a fox that could talk, and so on. Of course, the imperial court did not allow foxes to talk, and the people were not allowed to dig stones from the river. However, there were still people who laid a piece of white cloth in a corner of the street and sold some valuable antiques that were unknown whether they were real or fake. There were rich people in the capital, and there were also rich people who were interested in these things. The capital's West Market. After the market opened at dawn, The shouting continued until the market closed at night. Glazed statue blessed by Master Sandalwood, 5 taels of silver for 1. The chair that His Highness Jianghu of Silla sat on, 100 taels of silver. Selling a knife, a treasured knife passed down from my ancestors, able to cut copper, iron, gold and jade. The original price is 10,000 taels, now only 5,000 taels, only 5,000 taels. There were all kinds of things for sale on the streets of the capital. A while ago, someone was selling underwear worn by His Highness Jianghu of Silla. Later it was confirmed that it was not Jianghu of Silla, and the seller was arrested and sent to prison for fraud. Sometimes the people would gather around to watch the excitement, to see what was so special about the chair that His Highness Jianghu of Silla sat on, to see if the Buddha statue blessed by Master Sandalwood would glow, to see if the treasured knife passed down from my ancestors could cut iron like mud, and so on. A man with a long knife at his waist walked up to the man selling the knife and asked, "This knife of yours, is it really as good as you say?" The man smiled, "A treasured knife is a treasured knife. In front of everyone, if I lie to you, I'll give you 5,000 taels of silver for free." Hearing this, the man smiled, drew out the long knife at his waist and said, "This knife of mine is just an ordinary one, you can try." The man also drew out the knife in his hand, handed it to him and said, "You can try it yourself." The man looked at him and suddenly said warily, "If I break this saber, you won't ask me to pay for it, right?" "How could that be?" The man shook his head and pointed at the crowd. "Today everyone here is a witness. If my family's treasured saber is broken by this brother, I don't need him to compensate." Seeing this, the man no longer hesitated. He held 2 sabers in each hand and chopped down. Clang. After the sound of metal clashing, the saber that he brought with him broke, but the man's family heirloom saber was not damaged in the slightest. He stared blankly at the broken blade on the ground with a pained expression on his face. He then looked at the man and said, "How dare you sell weapons privately and break my family heirloom? I'm going to arrest you and bring you to the authorities." The Jing kingdom was very strict with the control of weapons. Without the permission of the government, it was illegal to sell weapons. Of course, the regulations in this area had always been very lax. However, if it was investigated carefully, the man's act of selling knives on the street had indeed violated the law. The man looked at the big man who was stunned on the spot and said, "It's fine if I don't arrest you unless you compensate me with this knife." The man who sold the saber snatched back the saber and grabbed the man to beat him up. Some of the crowd stayed to watch while others shook their heads and left. Recently there were many people selling ancestral treasured sabers and swords on the street. A few days ago there were even people selling snowguzzler sabers and peerless swords. They had heard too many stories in the brothel and were obsessed. This man actually knew how to use the trick of injuring himself to gain the confidence of others. It was a pity that his appetite was too big. If it was really a divine weapon, it would be worth it. However, there was a 90% chance that it was just a clumsy scam. Among the people who stayed, some of them could not help but come forward to verify it. The man was quite generous and seemed to be very confident in his family heirloom saber. He did not refuse anyone and looked very confident. Gradually, people were surprised to find that this saber seemed to be really unusual. When ordinary sabers came into contact with it, they would either break in 2 or be cut. Although it could not be said to be able to cut iron like mud, it could really be regarded as a treasured saber. This kind of divine weapon was very popular in the martial arts world. Many rich families in the capital also liked to collect them. In the crowd, a man who looked like a servant looked at the man and said, "The one selling the saber, take your saber and follow me." "All right." The man's face lit up. He immediately put away the saber and followed the servant into a big house. The crowd knew that this man's saber had caught someone's eye. This 5,000 taels of silver was a little too easy to obtain. When the crowd dispersed, another voice came from the crowd. "What family heirloom saber? Didn't you buy it? Didn't you see that the saber is brand new?" "Nonsense, this kind of divine weapon must have been made by a master. How could an ordinary shop buy it? It's the newly opened shop in front. It's called Sword Greeting Villa. It said that the signboard was personally inscribed by His Majesty. You will know once you take a look. A new weapon shop called Sword Greeting Villa opened in the capital. All the weapons sold were divine weapons. In terms of smelting and forging, they were definitely much better than these laymen. He also hoped that they could take a big step from theory to practice and come up with something more practical. Halfway through eating the apple, he looked up and saw Fang walking over from a distance. His face was a little ugly. He looked at Li Yi and said, "Young master, there is news from the Wu Kingdom, there is news from the Wu Kingdom." Chapter 1046. For the sake of Mississippi Lu's precious disciple, Li Yi had sent people to the Wu Kingdom to gather information a long time ago. During this period of time, news came in one after another. They were all about the stalemate between the forces loyal to the late emperor and the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom. It was neither good nor bad, however, judging from Fang's current expression, it could not be anything good. Li Yi took a letter from him, opened it and looked at it. The letter said that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom had secretly recruited several rebel forces. Half a month ago, they besieged Princess Duanrong who had rebelled. In that battle, the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom won a complete victory. Princess Duanrong's side suffered a crushing defeat. The imperial court reclaimed all the cities they had seized. As for Princess Duanrong, her whereabouts were still unknown. Unknown meant that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom had not found her. This was the silver lining in the misfortune. Li Yi looked at Fang and asked, "Does Rui know about this?" Rui was not in the stockade. She had returned a few days ago. She should still be busy subduing the other forces in the fringe. Fang nodded and said, "I've already sent someone to deliver the news. She should know soon." Li Yi rubbed the space between his brows and said helplessly, "Go find her. Immediately." Second Miss Lu had become a lot gentler. She wouldn't retaliate even if she was spanked. She was like a completely different person from before. However, there was something else in her character that wouldn't change easily. Back then, she had traveled thousands of miles to find her brother-in-law. She had chased him from the capital to Shuzhou, then from Shuzhou to the Qi Kingdom. She had rescued him from the hands of Taoist nun. After learning that Yang Liuking's fate was unknown, she might have run from the fringe to the Wu Kingdom to find her only disciple. If he and Rui were not by her side, no one could stop her. Li Yi did not object to Rui's search for Yang Liuking. After all, she was already half a member of the Li family after spending so much time together. Just based on the fact that she called him martial aunt, Li Yi would not sit idly by and watch her get into trouble. He and Rui did not blame her for leaving without saying goodbye. She had too many burdens on her shoulders, such as the hatred of her country and family. Even so, she did not bend her spine. It could only be said that Rui had an incredible disciple and he had an incredible martial nephew. But no matter how many experts the Lu Alliance had, no matter how good their weapons were, they would not be able to fight against the country. So he needed to stop Rui in time when she was impulsive, so that he could make a long-term plan. After saying goodbye to Rui and the others, Li Yi, Fang, and Su set off immediately. There was no need to bring too many people. The elites and core disciples of the Alliance were by Rui's side. Fang was there to watch the fun, and Su was there to deal with all kinds of unexpected situations. He only hoped that when they arrived, Mississippi Lu would not be so impulsive. In the Wu Kingdom. In the imperial capital. A eunuch gently knocked on the door of a luxurious palace and pushed it open. Inside the palace there were bookshelves on both sides, and the bookshelves were densely packed with books. Right in front of them was a table, and behind the table sat a figure. The eunuch bowed to the ground and asked respectfully, "Your Majesty, those rebels have arrived in the imperial capital. General Qing asked me to ask your Majesty, how should we deal with them?" The figure behind the table put down the book in his hand and said, "Since they are rebels, General Qing should know how to deal with them. There's no need to ask me about such a small matter." "Yes. Your servant will reply to General Qing now. Your servant will take his leave." The eunuch bowed again and was about to turn around and leave. "Is there any news about Qing and Fu? Before he walked out of the palace, the figure behind the table spoke again. The eunuch turned around and bowed again. "Your Majesty, General Qing said that this time, we will definitely deal with these two rebels." "Shut up." A reprimanding voice suddenly came from inside the palace. Looking at the figure behind the table who stood up, the eunuch's face immediately turned pale. He knelt on the ground and said anxiously, "Your Majesty, please spare my life. Your Majesty, please spare my life. Although they took the wrong path, they are still the princess and prince of the Wu Kingdom. How can a slave like you impose the word rebels on them?" A skinny young man walked over from the front. His long and narrow eyes glanced at the eunuch and he said in a low voice, "Go and receive your punishment. Don't do it again. Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you, Your Majesty." The eunuch hurriedly kowtowed. "Get up." The skinny young man waved his hand and asked, "Is there any news about them?" After the eunuch stood up, he immediately replied, "Your Majesty, General Cheng said that he has already found traces of Princess Duanrong and Prince Jing. At most, he will be able to bring them back in a month. Tell him that they must not be harmed. Bring Qing, and Fu, back safely." If even a strand of their hair is harmed, I will hold him responsible. Yes, Your Majesty, I will definitely bring Your Majesty's message to General Cheng. The skinny young man waved his hand and said, "All right, you can leave now." After the eunuch left, the skinny young man turned around with one hand behind his back. Only then did he realize that there was another person in the palace. It was an old man with white hair and beard. At this moment he was sitting on the seat that the skinny young man had just sat on. This was the imperial study, a seat that only the emperor could sit on. However, the young man was not angry or annoyed. Instead, he slowly walked forward and asked with a smile, "Imperial uncle, why do you have time to come here today?" The old man raised his head to look at him, and a sliver of disappointment appeared in his murky eyes. He said, "The blood that flows in the three of you is the blood of the royal family. You've already killed too many people. Just let these two children go. They can't threaten your throne. What you should do is to flatten the rebellious forces and return peace to the world as soon as possible." The young man was startled. Then he sighed and said, "Granduncle, you still don't believe me. Back then father and brother were suspicious. I kept retreating and retreating again and again. In the end, I really couldn't retreat anymore. If I didn't protect myself, I wouldn't be standing here talking to Granduncle. How do you expect me to believe you?" The old man stood up and looked at him. He asked, "I only traveled outside for half a year. After I returned to the imperial capital, you killed my brother, murdered my father, and forced my mother to death. Half of the officials in the imperial court died and another half ran away. The border army rebelled and another 3 provinces rebelled. How do you expect me to believe you? Whether what happened back then was right or wrong, whether Imperial Uncle is willing to believe me or not, I don't want to mention it again." The young man turned around and walked into the hall. He said, "Now our Wu kingdom is in a deep quagmire. The 2 kings of the Qi kingdom are fighting for power. However, the Jing kingdom is developing rapidly and suppressing all the other countries. I will suppress the chaos in the Wu kingdom as soon as possible. I also hope that Imperial Uncle can consider the overall situation and think for the sake of the Wu kingdom. If I didn't think for the sake of the Wu kingdom, I would have killed you with my palm." The old man walked past him and said calmly, "I don't care about the suppression of the rebellion. I don't want to look into what happened in the past. But I only warn you. Don't do anything to those 2 children again. Don't force me to do it." His last words were still echoing in the young man's ears. Then he disappeared. Suppress the rebels and restore peace to the world. But what if they are the rebels? The young man looked out of the door and murmured in a low voice, "Warn me? I am the emperor. Why should I be warned? Who else can warn me?" A hint of gloominess appeared on his face. He clenched his fists tightly in his sleeves. His nails dug deep into his flesh. Chapter 1047. In a mansion somewhere in the imperial capital of the Wu kingdom. Several figures were sitting in the courtyard, talking in low voices. Behind them were dozens of other figures. They were the elite subordinates who had entered the imperial capital with them. What do you think they will bestow upon us this time? It shouldn't be a small one. If it weren't for us, they wouldn't have been able to defeat Princess Duanrong so easily. General Cheng has already gone to the palace to ask. There should be news soon. This world is really mysterious. At first, I wanted to be a thief, but as I did so, I actually became an official. I never dreamed that I, Big Head Ma, would be able to wear the hat of an official for the rest of my life. The few of them were all rebels. After the Wu kingdom fell into chaos a few years ago, they rose up in revolt and proclaimed themselves kings. A few days ago, they were recruited by the imperial court and worked together with the imperial court to defeat another powerful rebel army. This time, they had come to the capital to receive their rewards and be promoted to officials. As they were talking, someone suddenly knocked on the door. Immediately, someone stood up and said with a smile, "Could it be that General Cheng has returned?" He personally went to open the door and saw the familiar face of General Cheng. "Haha, General Cheng, from now on we are colleagues." Puff. Before he could finish speaking, his body suddenly trembled. He lowered his head to look at a spear that had pierced through his chest. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth as he looked at the man in front of him and said in pain, You. The man calmly pulled out the spear and then waved his hand. "Release the arrows." Rows of archers immediately swarmed in. In the courtyard there were endless curses and screams. "Cheng, you didn't keep your promise. I won't let you off even if I become a ghost. What are you doing? We're on the same side, we're on the same side." In the land of chaos. Near the top of a mountain in the Wu kingdom, a man with a dignified appearance was pacing back and forth in the hall. There was a hint of anxiety on his face. Report. A figure quickly rushed in from the entrance of the fort. After rushing in, he knelt on one knee and said loudly, reporting to General Wei, Her Highness was ambushed by the Imperial Court in Lin Province. Fortunately, she has successfully escaped and will be here soon. The man's face darkened, and he immediately said, Qin, you will personally lead 500 men to receive His Highness. Behind him, a man knelt on one knee and bowed, Understood. The other man hesitated for a moment before asking, General, sending 500 people at the same time is too big of a commotion. If the Wan brothers find out, I'm afraid. The middle-aged man's face darkened. The Wan brothers were a group of bandits dozens of miles away from this place. They had a large number of people and were extremely powerful. In the past few years, there had been occasional friction between the two sides. If the other side took advantage of the situation and attacked, it would be a big problem. He thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, Your Highness's safety is more important. Qin set off immediately. At this moment, a weak voice suddenly sounded in everyone's ears. The messenger pursed his lips, looked at them and said, General, the Wan brothers, they... Immediately someone's expression changed and he asked, Could it be that they're making a move again? The messenger shook his head and said after a while, The Wan brothers, they... Someone couldn't hold it in any longer and said angrily, What happened to them? Tell us. They're repairing the road. The guard general was startled and frowned, asking, Repairing the road? The messenger looked up at him and nodded, saying, Our spies saw it with their own eyes. Not only the Wan brothers but also the Black Blind of the Twin Forks Ridge, the Mountain Patrol Tiger of the White Tiger Ravine. He pointed out the names of several famous bandit leaders in the vicinity, swallowed his saliva and said, They are all repairing roads. The Wan brothers, the Black Blind, the Mountain Patrol Tiger. These people he had just mentioned were originally the bandits of the Wu Kingdom. In the early years they were just a small group of bandits roaming the border provinces. Later on the country was in turmoil, and some people gathered a huge force to form a separatist regime. In a small area, they were able to stand up to the imperial court. There were also people like the Wan brothers. Their strength was neither strong nor weak. They couldn't stand up to the imperial court and were unwilling to submit to other major forces, so they simply fled into the land of chaos, occupied a mountain and proclaimed themselves as kings. Over the years, they grew stronger like a rolling snowball and had long become the overlords of the mountain. They often left the mountain to plunder the common people and caravans. The guard general wanted to eliminate them, but they were powerless. Anyone would find it strange that such bandits would suddenly stop plundering and run off to do something as mindless as repairing roads. Someone seemed to recall something and said, General, I heard that 2 years ago, a new force rose in the Jing Kingdom. They had extraordinary strength and forcefully opened up the trade road connecting the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. They swept away all the bandits along the road and escorted the traveling caravans and pedestrians. The bandits they subdued were all forced to pave the road and repair the bridge. The guard general looked at him and asked, You're saying that those people have already come here and subdued the Wan brothers, the Black Blind, and the Mountain Patrol Tiger at the same time, making these overlords personally pave the road for them and open up the trade road? Apart from this, I can't think of any other reason. Let's not talk about whether they came to the Wu Kingdom or not. Subduing the Wan brothers, the Black Blind, and the Mountain Patrol Tiger at the same time. Do you think there's such a powerful force in the land of chaos? The guard general shook his head and said, No matter what the Wan brothers are up to, let's first bring the princess and His Highness King Jing here safely, then we'll think about it. The man looked at the guard general in silence for a moment before he said, General, what I mean is, if they really subdued the Wan brothers, the next one will be us. What does this have to do with us? The guard general frowned again and asked, We have no problem with them subduing bandits, but we are not bandits. Why would they attack us? Do they really think the land of chaos is their territory? Dozens of miles away on the mountain road. A dark mass of people were busy on the mountain road. Behind them there was a long gray mountain road. A bald man stepped hard on the mountain road. After confirming that there was no problem with the quality, he continued to walk forward. He thought to himself, this thing called cement is really useful. It's much more convenient than quarrying stones from the mountains to pave the road. On a nearby mountain top, a young man looked at the woman in front of him with a respectful gaze and said, Leader, this is news from the Wu Kingdom. After the rebel army was defeated, Princess Duanrong disappeared. The Wu Kingdom's imperial court is also trying hard to find her. After reading the news, Mississippi Lu was silent for a moment before she said, Send a letter to the stronghold. Tell them that I will return after a while. Leave the matters here to Lu Luo for the time being. Where are you going? A voice came from outside the door. When the young man saw the three people walking in, he cupped his hands and immediately retreated. Mississippi Lu looked at them and asked, "Why are you here?" Li found a chair and sat down. He said, "If we didn't come, we would have gone to the Wu Kingdom to look for you in a few days." Li was somewhat glad that he had rushed over as soon as possible. If he had been a day and a half later, he might have had to follow Rui's example and chase after his sister-in-law. Mississippi Lu looked at him and said seriously, "I can't leave her alone." Li nodded and said, "I didn't ask you to leave her alone. I just want to tell you not to be impulsive. It's impossible to save her from the hands of the Wu Kingdom's imperial court by yourself or with the help of Lu Meng. We have to think about it at length. Don't forget she's also my martial niece." Mississippi Lu finally nodded. Seeing his travel-worn appearance, she asked, "Are you hungry? I'll cook a bowl of noodles for you first." Fong rubbed his stomach and looked at her. He asked, "Second miss, can you cook another bowl?" Ahem. The sloppy old man coughed softly. Fong looked at him and said, 3 bowls. Chapter 1048. The conditions in the mountains were harsh. Unlike in the stockade village, they couldn't eat delicacies here. They could only eat noodle soup with a few green vegetables floating on top. Even so, Li still ate with relish. Only now did he realize that he had misunderstood Rui. She was not unruly and unreasonable. She could be brutal and violent, gentle and virtuous, proud and charming, and domineering. Marrying a girl like her was equivalent to marrying several at the same time. God was really kind to him. Old Fong was also eating happily. He had truly lived a hard life, so he never haggled over what he ate. The sloppy old man didn't care either. In his eyes, there was only Wu Dao and second granduncle, and perhaps Changda and the Taoist nun he had been longing for a long time. After eating and drinking to their heart's content, it was time to get down to business. Whether it was Mississippi Lu alone or with the elites of the Lu League, it was not a good idea to rashly enter the Wu Kingdom to look for Yangliuking. The Wu Kingdom was a little smaller than the Jing Kingdom, but not by much. Without any clues, it would take them forever to search for Yangliuking like headless flies. It was better to stay put. Instead of looking for a needle in a haystack, it was better to continue to subdue the forces in the fringe while waiting for news. There were many people in the Wu Kingdom who were more eager to find Yangliuking than they were. There was no doubt about that. Moreover, there was news from the Wu Kingdom that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom didn't care about her life and death. They ordered the local authorities to capture her alive. In this case, there was no need to be anxious. He just needed to be the fisherman who reaped the benefits in the end. This was what he liked to do the most. Mississippi Lu was not stubborn. After Li Yi analyzed all the pros and cons for her, she was not so impulsive anymore. Li Yi looked at her and said, "Don't worry, once there is news from the Wu Kingdom, we will immediately take the elites of the Lu League to rescue her. As long as she is not imprisoned in the Imperial Palace, we will be able to rescue her. As for the Wu Kingdom, we will send more spies to gather information. In fact, even if she was locked up in the palace, it was not impossible to rescue her, but it would be more troublesome and dangerous. She could not torment second granduncle all day." Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "Are we just going to wait like this now?" Li Yi pondered for a moment and said, "If you're bored, you can first unite the fringe. There aren't many strongholds left, right?" Mississippi Lu nodded. "Not much." General Wei slowly paced around the room with his hands behind his back, murmuring, "What the hell are the Wan brothers doing?" A trace of doubt appeared on his face, but he quickly shook his head and stopped thinking about it. The bald man raised his eyebrows and said loudly, "Eradicating evil for the people. Enforcing justice on behalf of the heavens." The middle-aged man turned to him and asked, "We are not bandits. We are just living in seclusion here. We have not done any evil deeds. How can you say we're eradicating evil for the people?" The bald man's expression was a little unpleasant. What kind of person would occupy a mountain and live in seclusion in a chaotic place where bandits were everywhere? Did they have nothing better to do? In the past, many people had explained this to them. Now they had all gone to repair roads. The middle-aged man looked at Li Yi and said, "You go back. We will mind our own business. Otherwise, don't blame us for being rude." Li Yi shook his head. They didn't come here to reason with these people. No matter who they were, this was a strategic place that they had to fight for. There was no need to reason with the bandits. Rude? The bald man smiled and weighed a black object in his hand. He asked, "Do you know what this is?" He lit the fuse and threw it behind a half-collapsed wall outside the stockade village. Boom. A deafening sound was heard, and the ground under everyone's feet shook. Even though these heavenly punishments were specially made and had limited destructive power, it was enough to collapse the wall. The middle-aged man looked at the flying smoke and dust. He was stunned for a moment and his expression finally changed. This is the Jing Kingdom's heavenly punishment. In front of him, a strong man had already put a knife to his neck. He grinned and said, "Surrender or I will raze this place to the ground." General Wei, hearing the voice behind him, the middle-aged man's face turned pale. After a long time, he waved his hand behind him and said in a hoarse voice, "Put down your weapons, don't resist." He looked at the charred ground and his face turned even paler. The Jing Kingdom's heavenly punishment was a nightmare on the battlefield. With heavenly punishment, it was enough to defeat enemies who were several times stronger than oneself. He had long heard of the heavenly punishment divine weapon, but he had always regretted that he had never seen it. However, he never expected that the first time he saw it would be under such circumstances. This wave of bandits did not have many people, only about 200 to 300. They were afraid of the power of the heavenly punishment and did not put up much resistance. Out of professional habit, after subduing a wave of bandits, the first thing they did was to search for the treasures they had plundered over the years. According to the Baldi, these were the poorest bandits they had ever robbed. Other than some food, there was nothing valuable. Li Yi began to believe what they had just said. They were not bandits, but as a colleague of the same profession he felt embarrassed for the bandits. Just now, he seemed to have heard the bandit leader's subordinates call him general. They did not even pay attention to the organization and actually copied the military. How could he be a good bandit? The middle-aged man's hands were tied behind his back, but his back was still straight. A Baldi stood beside him and as he swayed he asked, "Tell me honestly, what's your name, where do you live, how many people are in your family, are you married?" The middle-aged man looked at him but did not speak. The Baldi poked his chest and frowned, "I'm asking you a question, be honest." "Son-in-law, second miss, there's still one more." Fong walked in from the outside with a man in his hand. The man was floating in the air, waving his hands and feet randomly while shouting, "What are you doing, are you crazy? I have something important to report to General Wei." When he looked up and saw that familiar figure, he immediately said, "General Wei, it's not good. Her Highness the Princess is surrounded by the Imperial Army in the Thorns Ridge. Deputy General Chen and 500 soldiers are fighting with their lives on the line. I'm afraid they won't be able to hold on for long." Before he finished speaking, he widened his eyes, looking at the General Wei who was tied up like a fried dough twist. "General, what is he playing at?" Li Yi looked at him and after being startled for a while, he asked, "What princess?" The man glared at him and said angrily, "Are you stupid? Of course it's Princess Duanrong." Chapter 1049. Princess Duanrong. Li Yi and Mississippi Lu looked at each other, then shifted their gaze to the man and asked, "What did you just say?" "Say it again." "Shut up." The tied-up middle-aged man glared at the man, breathing rapidly and his eyes almost popping out of their sockets. He began to struggle strenuously. The rope on his body rubbed red marks on his exposed skin. No matter how slow the man who was brought over by Fong was, he knew that General Wei was tied up like this and was definitely not playing some indescribable game. Looking at Li Yi and Mississippi Lu, he said with a trembling voice, You, who are you?" Li Yi looked at the middle-aged man and shook his head. "Don't waste your energy. The more you struggle, the tighter the rope is." He didn't know who had just tied the rope in such a shameful way. He looked at Lao Fong and said, "Untie him." As soon as the rope was untied, the middle-aged man suddenly rushed out of the village. Of course he was stopped by Fong. He lowered his voice and roared, "Let me go, I have something important to do. When I come back you can do whatever you want of me." "What's the use of going alone? Are you going to die?" Li Yi looked at him and said indifferently before asking, "The princess he mentioned just now, is it Princess Duanrong of the Wu Kingdom, Yangliuking?" The middle-aged man no longer struggled and looked at Li Yi with a burning gaze. "How do you know the princess' name?" Li Yi signaled Fong to let him go with his eyes. Mississippi Lu had already walked to the side and was whispering something to Bai Su, who had a small chest. Li Yi looked at the Baldi beside him and said, "Let them all go." The middle-aged man stood in a daze. He had experienced several ups and downs in a short period of time. Even if his mind was extremely firm, he still couldn't calm down for a while. Fong patted his shoulder and comforted him, "Don't be nervous, we're on the same side." Thorns Ridge. The Thorns Ridge was located at the border of the Wu Kingdom, and several dozen kilometers deeper into the Thorns Ridge was a chaotic land without jurisdiction. The nearby civilians and merchants wouldn't easily set foot there. Thorns Ridge, somewhere in the forest. The deputy general named Qin wiped away the blood on his forehead and said in a hoarse voice, "Princess, I will lead 200 men tonight and we will fight our way out. When the time comes, we will stop them while the rest of us will escort you and His Highness King Jing to the north. Once we reach the fringe, we will meet up with General Wei and they won't be able to do anything to you too." Opposite him was a young woman with disheveled hair and bloodstains on her body. However, there was no fear on her face. Her gaze was sharp as she shook her head and said, "Tonight's surprise attack, everyone retreat with me, Princess." Qin looked at him and said in a deep voice, "We have been forced to this point and there is no way out. This general hopes that your highness will not be stubborn and will look at the bigger picture. Imperial sister, I don't want to die, I don't want to die." A 13 or 14-year-old youngster staggered over, wiped his tears and cried, "Let's surrender, they won't kill me if we surrender, I don't want to die." Yang Liuqing looked at him with a complicated expression, but didn't say anything. Qin looked at the youngster before him, clenched his teeth and said, "Your Highness King Jing, surrendering is useless, they won't let us go." A trace of resentment suddenly appeared on the youngster's face. He pointed at him and loudly said, "It's all your fault, it's all your fault, if you hadn't killed so many of their people, they definitely wouldn't have killed us. Shut up." Yang Liuqing finally couldn't help but berate. He looked left and right and said, "Take him away." When the two guards carried him away, he was still flailing his arms and legs, shouting, "Imperial sister, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, save me, save me." When the youngster's voice could no longer be heard, Yang Liuqing looked at Qin and asked, "What's the situation at the foot of the mountain?" Qin pondered for a moment and said, "They are now temporarily stationed at the foot of the mountain. They sent a letter up, saying that as long as we surrender, they won't hurt your highnesses. The deadline is tomorrow morning and if we don't surrender by tomorrow morning they will attack. They won't hurt." Yang Liuqing looked at the setting sun in the sky and said, "Based on second brother's character, I don't think he will let us go. He can't wait to kill all the princes, how could he let your highnesses go?" An old figure walked over, lightly coughed twice and said, "Let's do as General Qin said, we will force our way out tonight, and your highness will bring King Jing to the fringe to meet General Wei." "Prime Minister." The old man waved his hand and interrupted her, "As long as your highness and King Jing are safe, we still have a chance." Qin. He suddenly shouted in a low voice. "Yes, General. Arrange for our men to attack the foot of the mountain tonight, and escort your highnesses out of here." "Yes, Prime Minister." Qin turned and left without looking back. They still had 300 men who could fight. If they forced their way out, there was still a glimmer of hope. After Qin left, the old man looked at the forest in the distance, which was gradually disappearing into the darkness and suddenly said, "Your Highness, if you can escape this time, don't come back." Yang Liuqing looked at him, her lips slightly parted and said, "Prime Minister." The old man stretched out his hand and lightly pressed down, signaling her to stop talking. Then he said again, "King Jing is useless. This heavy responsibility should not fall on your Highness' shoulders. Your Highness, go to the Qi Kingdom, go to the Jing Kingdom, forget about the Wu Kingdom, forget about the hatred, forget about Princess Duanrong and live a normal life." Yang Liuqing shook her head and said, "I once swore that if I can't avenge my father, my mother and my brother, I am not a human. After all, we have nothing left." The old man sighed and said, "The Jing Kingdom is like the sun at noon, growing stronger day by day. The third prince of the Qi Kingdom has the heart to be the ruler of the world, and he also has the ability to govern the country. Yang Zhe killed his brother and father and it is intolerable. Perhaps the Wu Kingdom is doomed, but the people are pitiful." Yang Liuqing lowered her head, clenched her fists and gritted her teeth and said, "I will not give up." The old man looked at her, and a trace of tenderness appeared in his eyes. Finally he shook his head, sighed and turned to leave. Yang Liuqing stood where she was for a long time. She clenched her fists so tightly that her nails had sunk deep into her palms. She looked up at the round moon in the sky, and her face was full of determination. But behind this unswerving determination, there was a deeply hidden weakness and helplessness. If it was possible, why would she be willing to shoulder such a deep blood feud? Why would she be willing to shoulder such a heavy responsibility that was suffocating her? Why wouldn't she want to be an ordinary woman? How she wanted to be an ordinary woman? Tomorrow would be the 15th. 3 years ago, she didn't have to face all the things she had to face today. She could still live in that small courtyard, the courtyard that carried almost all the happiness of her life. In that small courtyard, There was her Shifu who was strict but spared no effort in teaching her to be cold on the outside but warm on the inside. There was her Uncle Master Li Yi who was very lazy but never stumped by anything. There was also her gentle and virtuous Uncle Master Rui who had already reached the peak of martial arts. And there was also the innocent, silly but kind Miss Xuanhuan. That small courtyard and everything about Lu Meng were things that she could never let go of and forget in this lifetime. How were they now? When she left, Uncle Master Rui was pregnant. The child should be almost 3 years old now. She didn't know if it was a boy or a girl. Was Uncle Master Li Yi still so afraid of Shifu? She didn't know how his relationship with Miss Ruoqing and Miss Zuemo was. She didn't know if Shifu still often bullied Uncle Master. She also didn't know if Shifu had won against Princess Emingzu. She also didn't know if Shifu still blamed her until now. She turned her head and looked in a certain direction. She knew that they were now in Shuzhou, a chaotic place away from here. But this was a distance that she would never be able to cross in this lifetime. At the foot of the Thorns Ridge, figures were swaying and countless flames were blazing. At the forefront of the crowd, 2 generals on horseback were looking at the pitch-black mountain road. One of them turned his head and said, "General, we still have to wait for a night. Why don't we let them camp here first?" "No need." The man beside him waved his hand and said, "Attack at midnight." "Attack at midnight?" The man was startled and asked in disbelief, "But didn't His Majesty give an imperial edict that the princess and King Jing cannot be hurt?" "I don't know what imperial edict." The man in armor grinned and said in a low voice, "I only know that His Majesty wrote in the secret letter, 'Leave no one alive.'" Chapter 1050. The moonlight shone brightly above the Thorns Ridge. Several hundred figures were gathered in an open space. A man named Qin Qing was arranging something in a low voice. "Bai Chuan, lead 200 men and follow me to break out from the east." "Yes, sir." A thin man knelt on one knee, cupped his fists and said loudly, "Gu Yuan, lead the remaining 100 men and escort the 2 royal highnesses and the Prime Minister away. Head north. Once you enter the land of Bedlam, General Wei will send someone to receive you." Another man respectfully replied with a solemn expression, "Yes, sir." Qin Qing's gaze swept across and said, "Remember this well. At all times and under all circumstances, you must ensure the safety of the 2 royal highnesses." In the distance, Yang Liuqing looked at the 300 soldiers that were quickly mobilized. She clenched her fists and revealed a trace of grief. "Your Highness must remember to prioritize the overall situation." An old voice came from behind her. She loosened her clenched fists, looked at the old man and softly said, "The mountain road is difficult and inconvenient. General Chen will arrange for a few people to take turns to carry the Prime Minister, but it will inevitably be bumpy. The Prime Minister will have to endure a little." The old man smiled and waved his hand, saying, "This old man was born in Sangzhou and will be buried in Sangzhou. It can be considered a perfect ending. There is no need for such torment." Yang Liuqing looked at him and firmly said, "We will escape." Below the Thorns Ridge, a figure came from the side, walked to the front of the formation, bowed and said, "General, there is news from above. They plan to break out at midnight and escort the princess and King Jing all the way north into the land of Bedlam." The general, covered in full armor, patted the horse's head and said, "Midnight?" He smiled and said, "Pass down my order. Bring forward the time of the attack by an hour." "Yes, sir." In the land of Bedlam, the mountain ranges shrouded in darkness were like giant hibernating beasts. On the backs of these giant beasts, there were figures rapidly moving. Because Wei Liang's movements were too slow, he was carried on the back of a tall man. The man's skeletal frame made him feel pain, and the violent jolting made him dizzy and almost vomit. The man seemed to have noticed something. He turned around and said, "If you dare to vomit on me, I will throw you down from here." Wei Liang endured the disgust and asked with difficulty, May I ask this warrior, do you have a relationship with Her Highness?" Up until now, he still hadn't figured out what had happened. He didn't know what these people were doing. Why did they suddenly rush up to their mountain and capture all of them? He didn't know why they immediately let them go after hearing the news about the princess, and then rushed to the Thorns Ridge without stopping, seemingly to rescue the princess. He only knew that these people were strong, very strong. Any one of them could take down a dozen or even dozens of his resisting subordinates. His subordinates were all well trained, and they were all fierce soldiers who had fought on the battlefield. The weapons of these people were also very sharp. When his side swords and sabers clashed with them, they would either be chipped or simply broken into 2. They were highly skilled in martial arts, and each of them was equipped with a magical weapon. More importantly, they had that terrifying sky law. If they were really going to rescue the princess, Wei Liang's heart finally surged with infinite hope. You're talking about Miss Yang? The man smiled and said, of course we're familiar with each other. She scolded me a lot at that time and even robbed my position on the heaven list. This time I have to get back at her. Wei Liang didn't understand a single word of this man's words. However, it didn't matter. As long as they were going to rescue the princess, that was enough. He looked ahead and a hint of joy appeared on his face. He said, the Thorns Ridge is up ahead. Silhouettes leaped out of the forest one after another. They could already vaguely see the flickering flames in front of them. At the foot of the mountain, a deputy general looked to his side. After pondering for a moment, he asked, General, if we really kill the princess and King Jing won't? Swords have no eyes. It's normal to have some accidents on the battlefield. The general glanced at him and said, when the time comes, hand over the person who accidentally killed the two princes and ask to be demoted from his position. Demoted from my position? The general looked at him and said with a smile, just wait for 2 more years. In the future there will be glory, splendor, and wealth that you won't be able to enjoy. Just as his voice fell, a soldier suddenly came forward and reported, General, someone is coming from behind. Someone is coming? The general frowned and asked, who? There are a lot of them, about 200 people. We don't know their identities, but they are rapidly approaching. The general turned his horse around and said in a deep voice, inform everyone to prepare to meet the enemy. They had 1,000 people attacking the mountain, and another 1,000 people guarding the foot of the mountain. Wouldn't it be easy to deal with these mere 200 people? The figures on the opposite side stopped about 100 feet away from them. Although the moon was bright, they couldn't see clearly until the other side also raised their torches. Then he saw a bald man walking out. His head was glowing under the light of the torches, and he was holding something in his hand. People on the opposite side, listen up. You've been surrounded, 200 people against 1,000, and he dared to say that he was surrounded. Hearing the loud voice coming from the opposite side, the general's face darkened. Suddenly he saw a familiar figure behind the bald man. Wei Liang. He didn't expect to be able to catch all the rebels in one fell swoop this time. He waved his hand and said, they're all traitors and rebels. Kill them all, don't leave a single one alive. Wait a minute. The bald man on the opposite side suddenly shouted. The general raised his hand and the soldiers behind him stopped in their tracks. He wanted to hear what this bald man had to say in the face of death. Then he saw a little flame appear in the bald man's hand, and he struggled to throw something in his hand. That thing rolled to his feet. He sat on his horse and looked out. Boom. After an even more dazzling firelight, he couldn't see or hear anything. After this explosion, the army of nearly 1,000 people was left with only a series of screams and wails. At some point, someone finally couldn't help but scream. This heavenly punishment, this is heavenly punishment. It's heavenly punishment, this is heavenly punishment. General Wei died in battle. On the opposite side, the bald man who was hiding behind the mound walked out again. As if nothing had happened, he continued to shout, people on the opposite side, listen up. You've been surrounded. A deputy general got up from the ground and shook his head. He shook off the dirt on his body and stood up. He said loudly, they're outnumbered. Charge forward. Their heavenly punishment can't be used in close combat. If we charge forward, they won't be able to do anything. As soon as he finished speaking, dozens of flames streaked across like meteors and landed in the army. One of them landed at his feet. Time waits for no man. The situation on Yang Liuking's side was unknown. Li didn't have the time to waste on them. On the opposite side, behind a low mound, Wei Liang heard the deafening sound and the flashing flames. He looked at the man beside him and pursed his lips. He asked, brother, can I throw one myself? Heavenly punishment was extraordinary and had long been famous in the various countries. It was a sharp weapon on the battlefield and also a nightmare for countless people. However, heavenly punishment couldn't be used without restrictions. It was easily affected by the weather and distance. If the two armies were engaged in a chaotic battle, this kind of weapon that didn't distinguish between friend and foe naturally couldn't be used. Finally, a dozen people were lucky enough to avoid heavenly punishment and rushed to the front. Then they flew back at an even faster speed. An 8 feet tall burly man rushed out from behind the mound. Their swords, sabers, spears and halberds couldn't touch him at all. When they were hit by him, their bones were broken and blood foamed from their mouths. Some people clashed with their weapons. Their weapons broke, then their bodies. Some people only saw the flashing sword lights in the sky and then nothing else. Some people stood there in a daze. They put down their weapons and raised their hands. Then, tens and hundreds of people. Wei Liang looked at the dozens of people who walked out and then looked back. There were even more people watching from the back. He finally began to realize what kind of monsters had attacked their mountain today. Chapter 1051. The Lu Alliance had 200 elites and countless experts on the Heaven List and Earth List. In addition to Tianfa and the divine weapons in the eyes of ordinary people, Li didn't know where the limit of this combination was. If they were to fight against truly well-trained and well-coordinated elite soldiers, unless they were experts on the Heaven List, it would be difficult for them to display their individual strength. However, against 1,000 soldiers from the Wu Kingdom who couldn't even be considered elites, coupled with the fact that the other party had underestimated them and Tianfa, the battle ended very quickly. It could even be said that it was a crushing victory. Hundreds of people crouched on the ground and formed a circle with their hands on their heads. In reality, after the two high-ranking generals had died, the remaining soldiers had seen how terrifying Tianfa and the few experts on the Heaven List were. They didn't have much will to fight anymore. After all, although the other party had fewer people, each of them was like an inhuman monster with divine weapons and divine weapons. They also had the divine weapon Tianfa on the battlefield. No matter how they looked at it, there was no need to fight this battle. Wei Liang had fought for half his life and had seen and even personally participated in many battles where the weak won against the strong. However, this was the first time he had seen such a simple and unpretentious way of winning. He was worried about the princess, so he didn't think too much. He quickly walked forward and grabbed a person's collar. He asked, "Where's the princess? Where's Her Highness?" After a while, he ran to Li Yi's side with an anxious expression. He said, "They have another 1,000 people who have just attacked the mountain. Her Highness only has 300 soldiers who can fight. We have to go and help her quickly." Li Yi looked behind him and said, "Leave 50 people behind to watch them. The rest of you go up the mountain immediately." These captives had already lost their will to fight. Leaving 50 experts behind was enough. Not knowing the situation on the mountain, Li Yi didn't dare to delay and led everyone up the mountain immediately. Wei Liang walked a few steps and seemed to have thought of something. He cut off the heads of the two generals who had been killed by Tianfa and carried them in his hands. He ran up the mountain behind everyone. "Your Highness, you should surrender. Swords have no eyes. If you hurt the two princes, it won't be good." At the top of the mountain, a deputy general looked at the figure that was surrounded by hundreds of soldiers and was desperately resisting. Yang Liuqing's pure white clothes were already dyed red with blood. Some of it belonged to her and some belonged to her enemies. Behind her, the young man named Yang Fu had already fainted from fright and was protected by two people. The remaining 100 or so people around him had long since become bloodshot. A bitter smile appeared on Qin Qing's face. "Your Highness, I'm sorry. I'm afraid I won't be able to protect your Highness this time. You've already done your best." Yang Liuqing brandished the sword in his hand. Every time his sword stabbed out, a person would fall to the ground. One of her arms was injured and drooped weakly, but her expression was unprecedentedly calm. There was only sword light in her eyes. At the periphery of the crowd, the deputy general looked at the stalemate situation and waved to the 200 people behind him. "All of you attack together. If anyone resists, kill them without mercy. Leave no one alive." Boom. As soon as he finished speaking, before the people behind him could move, a loud sound suddenly rang in their ears. The sound was like a thunderclap, resounding through the mountains and into everyone's ears. The stalemate situation paused for a moment. Everyone couldn't help but look down the mountain. Boom, boom, boom. Streaks of dazzling flames appeared in their line of sight in an instant, followed by a deafening sound. "What's that? The mountain god is angry? There, that's the direction of the camp." Flames and loud sounds came from the direction of the camp. They looked down the mountain with a look of horror. Qin Qing took the opportunity to kill a few more people. He protected Yang Liuqing and quickly retreated into the forest. He looked back. The brilliant flames at the foot of the mountain had already been extinguished. It was as if nothing had happened. He looked at Yang Liuqing's injured arm. His expression was ugly. "Your Highness, you're injured?" Yang Liuqing didn't look at him. Instead, he stared blankly out of the forest and asked in disbelief, Did you guys hear anything just now? Your Highness, did you guys hear anything?" Qin Qing was startled. He nodded and said, "Yes, there was a loud sound and flames." A smile finally appeared on Yang Liuqing's face. He leaned against a tree and said, "Hold on a little longer. Just a little longer. Outside the forest, the deputy general looked down the mountain that had returned to silence. After a long time, he looked away and said, "Two people go and see what happened at the camp." With that, he looked back into the forest and gritted his teeth. "Half an hour. I'll give you another half an hour. If you can't break through, bring your heads to me." "Yes." As the hundreds of people approached the forest again, someone suddenly shouted, "General, there are people coming up from the foot of the mountain." Looking at the dozens of figures leaping up, the deputy general's expression froze. He asked, "Who are they?" In a few breaths' time, someone had already rushed up and threw two objects at his feet. "General Wei and General Xiao are dead. You have 10 breaths' time to surrender." With the help of the moonlight and the flames, the deputy general could already see what was at his feet. It was the heads of General Wei and General Xiao. He suppressed the shock in his heart and shouted, kill them quickly." Swoosh. As soon as he finished speaking, he heard the sound of wind breaking. He was shot between his eyebrows and fell to the ground. Boom. The dozens of people who had rushed up fell in a dazzling flame. The scene fell silent in an instant. Then it became a mess. No matter how strong the experts in the martial arts world were, even if they were grandmasters, their usefulness on the battlefield was limited. A group of well-trained and well-coordinated elite soldiers might not be able to do anything to a grandmaster, but it was no different from a nightmare for ordinary experts to be entangled by them. It was a pity that the group of people in front of them could not be considered elite soldiers. With the death of a few high-ranking generals, they immediately fell into chaos. A few heavenly punishment was enough to scare them out of their wits and make them put down their weapons and surrender. Of course, there were those who resisted with all their might. In the end, they really died. This was not the land of chaos. This was a battlefield. If they showed mercy to the enemy, they would not show mercy to themselves. The few generals were already dead, and those who resisted were also killed. The fact that the enemy could come up from the mountain road meant that the camp below had already been broken through by them. There was no chance of victory. The soldiers of the Wu kingdom all put down their weapons and were quickly controlled. Wei Liang looked worried. He walked forward and asked loudly, "Where's the princess? Where's the princess?" A figure poked his head out from behind a big tree in the forest and asked, "Are you General Wei?" Ching. Wei Liang hurried forward and looked at him. He asked, "Where's the princess?" As soon as he finished speaking, a weak figure walked out from the forest. Wei Liang took 2 steps forward and knelt down on one knee. He said loudly, "I'm late to the rescue. Please forgive me, Your Royal Highness." Yang Liuqing glanced at him and did not say anything. He continued to walk forward. Li Yi and Mississippi Lu stood there and watched as she walked slowly from afar. She seemed to be injured. Her steps were not steady, and her body was swaying as if she would fall at any time. Wherever she passed, the crowd automatically opened up a path for her. She walked to the front and stood in front of Mississippi Lu and Li Yi. She slowly knelt down and raised her head. Her eyes were filled with tears. "Your disciple greets Master and Uncle Master." Wei Liang widened his eyes at this scene. He did not hesitate for long before he knelt down on one knee and lowered his head at the same time. The princess had already knelt down.